The words middle class have such a nebulous meaning that they're effectively meaningless. In our political and social and economic discourse, so much is made about the middle class, and yet there's no real functional definition that everyone can agree upon, let alone scholars, but let's take the politicians and the general public. The words middle class have no real meaning. They're not really defined in terms of income. They're not really defined in terms of your relationship to the means of production. They're not really defined in terms of your quality of life. You're not really defining them in terms of your relationship to other people even. And so it's just a buzzword, a political buzzword that serves the interests of the rich and powerful. Look, historically at least, the term middle class was used to refer to a narrow group of people, not the broad population, but a narrow group of people who sort of fit neither in the proletariat working class mold nor in the capitalist bourgeoisie mold. And so it would include the sort of people who didn't really have an employer, yet didn't really extract surplus labor like a capitalist would from workers. So, for instance, people like doctors and lawyers, these sorts of people, maybe professors, tenured professors, they would fit this sort of middle class mold. And it wasn't really about how much money they made. It was about the fact that they had a lot of autonomy in their work, that even if they had an employer, they weren't really alienated from the final product of their work. Their work wasn't, mechanized. Their work wasn't atomized. There was this sense that they owned the product of their work from beginning to end. And yes, they often made higher incomes than average, but it was really fundamentally about, freedom within their own work. And then also that they weren't really an employer class. Maybe they would have assistants, maybe they would have receptionists or what have you, but on the whole, they were sort of independent from, the bourgeoisie proletariat struggle. That was a narrow middle class. But today, we use that term to basically refer to everybody who is not very, very rich or very, very poor. So while the middle class in a sociological and historical sense might only include, say, 10% of the population, with the working class being 85, 90%, the middle class being 5 to 10%, and the ownership class really being that 1 or 0.5 or 0.1%. The reality is that we use it to define 90% of the population. If you make $30,000 a year, you're middle class. And if you make $300,000 a year, some people might call you middle class, which basically means that unless you're destitute or unless you're a plutocrat, you're a middle class Joe or Jane. And you can see how this creates issues, right? You can see how this creates issues for our ability to understand inequality. You can see how this creates issues for our ability to understand the different experiences of people. To just homogenize somebody who makes $30,000 a year and struggles to put food on the table and doesn't have medical benefits, and compare that to somebody who literally has a six-figure salary, well into the six figures, who has private homes and has assistants and has cleaners and has private nannies for their kids, and on and on and on. These are fundamentally different worlds, and yet we homogenize them because no one wants to be seen as poor, because to be part of the middle class is to be seen as aspirational, to be seen as moving in the right direction. Yet very, very few people want to be seen as rich, because rightfully so, the rich are not held in high regard, because they're seen as exploitative, because they're seen as, extractive, because they're seen as parasitic in some ways, and not without reason. So even if you're quite wealthy, I've seen millionaires claim themselves to be middle class because they don't want to reckon with the fact that they're not part of the broad, noble, regular people. They're actually part of that narrow, cloistered, conspiratorial, parasitic ruling class. So if you can be a millionaire and claim to be middle class, you can sort of wipe your hands of the inequities that you play a role in causing and reinforcing and stabilizing. And that's a fundamental issue. And I also feel that the proliferation of the term middle class has been used rather purposefully to dilute the use of the term working class. Look, there is a middle class. I've heard some people argue that there's no such thing as the middle class, that there's the working class and there's the capitalist class, and those are the only two classes. But I don't quite agree. There is a middle class, and it is those sorts of people who fundamentally have a different relationship to the means of production. They're not quite capitalists, but they're not proletarianized either. Those people exist on an income basis somewhat, but more in their relationship to the means of production. There are working class people who make more money than middle class people in terms of sociological definition. If you work on an oil rig, you are undeniably a proletarianized working class person. Yet if you work in a law office as a lawyer, even with an employer, you might make less money than a oil rig worker, at least on a year-by-year basis. Maybe not over the course of your life, but in that work, you are kind of more definitively middle class. And I think that's an important distinction. A tenured professor might make less money than an oil rig worker, because I know how little professors can make in many parts of North America, but they are undeniably middle class in a way that an oil rig worker is not. But on the whole, the use of middle class to apply to 80-90% of the population is to obscure the reality that the vast majority of people are proletarianized. They have no control over their workplace. They have no control over their economic destiny. There is no essence of economic democracy. The ownership of the processes of their work is taken from them almost fully. And it's not even really about income, at least not fully, but it has this meaning in how it shapes their relationship to power levers, both in political and economic and cultural and social terms. And that's fundamentally important. And the use of the term middle class to apply to 90% of people really obscures that. But even if you want to make it about income, to truly understand things, it's not a helpful term at all. It really does paint everybody from $30,000 to $200,000 a year as this sort of homogenous middle class block, and it allows politicians to exploit that. So here in Canada, for instance, in 2015, Justin Trudeau promised a quote-unquote middle-class tax cut. And the tax cut was levied in part on raising the taxes on the 1%, on the very richest. That's a good thing. But the benefits of that tax cut, 75% of Canadians were too poor to access it. So it was really a shift of income from the top 1% to the top 25%. But that's not really middle class, is it? It's not really middle class if 75% of people don't apply, at least under our current definition. But because the term middle class is seen as applying to all regular people, and because people don't think about it critically, everyone sort of assumed that, hey, this is a middle class tax cut. I'm middle class. I'm going to get a tax cut. But if you made $40,000 a year, you didn't get that tax cut. Or if you were poor, you didn't get that tax cut. And even in 2019, where Justin Trudeau just won re-election, one of his key promises was a quote-unquote middle-class tax cut. But if you look at how it works, the very poorest people, including some folks who would be identified as middle class, get very, very small benefits. And while, again, this doesn't benefit the very, very richest, the biggest benefits go to people who make above average incomes, who are probably not what you'd think when you think middle class. We're not talking about people making $30,000 to $50,000 a year. We're talking about people making $90,000 to $120,000 or $130,000 or $140,000 a year. That's not really middle class in the way I would understand it, because in Canada, at least, making over $100,000 a year puts you in like the top 10, 15, maybe 5%, depending on where you live. It's a lot of money. Even in the big cities, even in Toronto and Vancouver, most people don't make that kind of money. So you can see how this obscures people's ability to critique political policy, whether it's on social terms and how we understand our relationship to the means of production and build class consciousness, or whether it's in terms of trying to understand the impact of redistributional policy and tax policy and have this assumption that middle class applies to me when maybe it does in some cases and maybe it doesn't in others, and there's no consistent definition, in that process. So I think it's really time that any left-wing force has to shunt away the use of the term middle class. It has no functional value in political discourse. Within academia, we can discuss that. We can discuss the nature of the professional middle class, doctors, lawyers, professors, other forms of professionals, certain types of artists, the clergy. These are all middle class professions. But from a political discourse, from getting elected, from the stump speeches, no Labor Party, no left-wing party should use the term middle class. We should go back to the term working class, because that defines the vast, vast, vast majority of people. 80, 90% of the population who are fundamentally working class. And that allows us to really get back to what needs to be done, which is to help those working class people understand that there is a class war and that class war is being levied against them by the social and political and economic elite. And by emphasizing the term working class, we can also get back to a policy of better understanding divisions within the regular people. I feel like it's a better term if we use working class and we use that to de-hegemonize middle class. We can get a better understanding of the differences within the 99%. So this is what I want to see, guys. I want to see us stop using the term middle class within everyday political discourse. It is a tool of the elite, by the elite, and for the elite, and we got to stop playing their game.